On a fog-laden November morning in 1923, 12-year-old twin sisters Margaret and Catherine Broussard were found standing perfectly still in the middle of Bayou Teche, 30 miles from their home in New Iberia, Louisiana. They had been missing for 6 days. When local fisherman Pierre Landry discovered them, both girls were bone dry despite standing waist-deep in murky swamp water. They spoke in perfect unison, repeating the same phrase over and over. "The water remembers what the earth forgets. The water remembers what the earth forgets." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What happened during those 6 missing days would baffle doctors, scientists, and investigators for decades to come. The girls had no memory of how they traveled 30 miles through treacherous swampland. They showed no signs of dehydration, exhaustion, or exposure despite Louisiana's brutal November weather. Most disturbing of all, both twins had developed identical scars on their foreheads in the shape of crescents, marks that appeared to have been carved with surgical precision, yet showed signs of being weeks old. The Broussard family physician, Dr. James Thibodaux, documented anomalies that defied medical explanation. Both girls' blood temperatures registered consistently at 94 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 degrees below normal human body temperature. Their heart rates synchronized perfectly, beating at exactly 58 beats per minute, even when separated by considerable distances. When one twin experienced pain, the other would cry out simultaneously, regardless of whether she could see or hear her sister. The mystery of the Broussard twins began long before that November morning in the bayou. It started with their birth 18 months earlier, on a night when supernatural forces seemed to converge over the small Cajun community of New Iberia like storm clouds gathering before a hurricane. Evangeline Broussard had endured a difficult pregnancy that local midwives whispered about in concerned tones around kitchen tables and church pews. The twins moved in her womb with an unnatural synchronization that made her belly ripple in perfect waves. During the final weeks of pregnancy, Evangeline reported dreams that felt more real than waking life. She saw herself walking through endless corridors filled with mirrors, each reflection showing her daughters at different ages, all speaking in unison words she could never quite remember upon waking. The night of the twins' birth, May 13, 1922, brought with it omens that even the most practical residents of New Iberia could not ignore. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in less than an hour, creating an unseasonable chill that made Spanish moss hang like icicles from ancient oak trees. Bullfrogs fell silent across the bayou country, their usual nighttime chorus replaced by an oppressive quiet that seemed to press against the ears of everyone within miles of the Broussard home. Marie Boudreau, the midwife who had delivered 3 generations of New Iberia babies, arrived at the Broussard cottage on Weeks Island Road to find Evangeline in labor that progressed with mechanical precision. Contractions came exactly 2 minutes apart with mathematical regularity that Marie had never witnessed in 40 years of delivering children. The labor lasted exactly 6 hours, and both twins emerged within seconds of each other, their umbilical cords intertwined in a pattern that formed what Marie would later describe as an intricate knot resembling Celtic symbols she had seen in her grandmother's prayer book. Margaret arrived first, followed immediately by Catherine, but both babies emerged in complete silence. No cries, no struggle for breath, just perfect stillness that made Marie's hands shake as she checked for signs of life. Both twins breathed normally and appeared healthy, but their eyes remained fixed on each other with an intensity that seemed impossible for newborns. When Marie tried to separate them for individual examination, both babies began screaming with a sound that made windows rattle throughout the cottage and sent every dog in the neighborhood into howling fits that lasted until dawn. Joseph Broussard, a sugar cane farmer whose family had worked the same land for 5 generations, watched his daughter's unusual behavior with growing concern as they grew from infants into toddlers. The twins never played separately, never spoke individual words, and seemed to communicate through glances and gestures that no one else could interpret. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They walked at exactly the same moment, spoke their first words in perfect unison, and developed an uncanny ability to anticipate each other's needs and desires with supernatural accuracy. Dr. Thibodaux, who had studied medicine at Tulane University, before returning to serve his hometown community, documented the twins' development with scientific curiosity that gradually transformed into genuine alarm. During routine examinations, he discovered that the girls' vital signs remained identical regardless of their activities, health status, or emotional states. When Margaret contracted measles at age 2, Catherine developed identical symptoms within hours despite being quarantined in separate rooms of the Broussard home. When Catherine broke her arm falling from their backyard oak tree, Margaret cried out in pain and favored her left arm for weeks until her sister's bone healed completely. The twins' ability to mirror each other's experiences extended beyond physical ailments to encompass knowledge and memories that seemed to transfer between them through invisible channels. Margaret could recite lessons that only Catherine had heard in school. Catherine could describe in perfect detail events that only Margaret had witnessed while her sister was elsewhere. When questioned separately about their shared experiences, both girls would provide identical accounts, using identical phrases and identical inflection patterns that made listeners' skin crawl with unease. Father Antoine Melanchon, the parish priest at St. Peter's Catholic Church, where the Broussard family attended weekly Mass, grew increasingly troubled by the twins' behavior during religious services. Both girls would stand and kneel simultaneously, without looking at each other or listening for cues from the congregation around them. They recited prayers in perfect harmony, but often continued speaking words that were not part of the traditional liturgy, phrases in what sounded like Latin but contained syllables that Father Melanchon did not recognize despite his theological education. During one particularly disturbing incident in the summer of 1923, just months before their disappearance, both twins began speaking during Father Melanchon's sermon about salvation and redemption. Their voices rose above the priest's words, carrying clearly through the small wooden church despite the fact that they were whispering. The congregation strained to hear what the twins were saying, and those closest to the Broussard family pew reported later that the girls were reciting what sounded like names and dates in chronological order. Emily Tran, who sat directly behind the twins with her own 3 children, wrote in her diary that night about the disturbing experience. Margaret and Catherine spoke for nearly 10 minutes, listing names I had never heard before. Sarah Hebert died April 3, 1847. Thomas Landry died September 17, 1851. Marie Boudreau died January 12, 1854. On and on they went, always giving full names and exact dates. Father Melanchon tried to continue his sermon, but everyone in the church was listening to those little girls instead. The strangest part was that they never paused to breathe, never stumbled over pronunciation, and never looked at each other or at any notes. It was as if they were reading from invisible books that only they could see. After Mass that Sunday, several elderly parishioners approached Joseph and Evangeline Broussard with growing concern about their daughter's unusual recitation. Augustine Boudreau, whose family had lived in Iberia parish since before Louisiana became a state, recognized several of the names the twins had spoken. They were ancestors of current new Iberia families, people who had died decades before the twins were born. The dates the girls provided matched exactly with death records kept in the parish archives, information that would have been impossible for 2 young children to access or memorize. Dr. Thibodaux began keeping detailed medical records of every interaction with the Broussard twins, documenting anomalies that seemed to increase in frequency and intensity as the girls approached their second birthday. Blood tests revealed unusual cellular structures that he had never encountered in medical literature. Both twins' blood contained elevated levels of minerals typically found in bayou water, despite the fact that they drank only well water from the Broussard family property. Their brain activity, measured during rare moments when they consented to medical examinations, showed synchronized patterns that suggested some form of continuous communication between their neural systems. Most disturbing to Dr. Thibodaux were the twins' responses to standard cognitive and developmental assessments. When asked to draw pictures, both girls would produce identical images without looking at each other's work. When given different colored crayons, they would create matching drawings using different colors, but maintaining perfect proportional relationships between all elements. When separated for individual testing, their performance scores remained identical across all categories of measurement, from memory recall to problem-solving abilities to creative expression. The physician's private notes, discovered decades later in his estate papers, revealed the depth of his concern about the twins' condition. Margaret and Catherine Broussard represent a phenomenon that challenges everything I learned in medical school about human development and individual identity. They function as a single consciousness housed in two separate bodies, or perhaps as two fragments of a consciousness that should have remained unified. I have consulted with colleagues at Tulane and at medical schools throughout the South, but none have encountered anything comparable to what I observe in these children. Dr. Thibodaux's most unsettling discovery came during a routine examination in October 1923, just weeks before the twins' disappearance. While checking their reflexes and responses, he noticed that both girls had developed small, perfectly circular marks on their foreheads, positioned identically above their left eyebrows. The marks appeared to be birthmarks, but Dr. Thibodaux was certain they had not been present during previous examinations. When he questioned the twins about the marks, both girls touched their foreheads simultaneously and replied in unison, "The water is calling us home." Evangeline Broussard had noticed changes in her daughter's behavior throughout the autumn of 1923 that filled her with growing dread. The twins had begun walking to the bayou behind their property every evening. At sunset, standing at the water's edge for exactly 1 hour before returning to the house without explanation. When their parents followed them on these evening walks, they discovered that Margaret and Catherine would stand motionless at the bayou's edge, staring into the dark water while their lips moved in silent conversation with something beneath the surface. Joseph Broussard attempted to prevent these evening walks by locking the twins in their bedroom after dinner, but somehow they continued to appear at the bayou each evening, despite locked doors and windows. The locks remained secure, the windows stayed latched from the inside. Yet neighbors reported seeing both girls standing by the water every night as the sun disappeared behind the cypress trees that lined Bayou Teche. On the morning of November 15th, 1923, Evangeline discovered that her daughters were missing from their bedroom. Their beds had been slept in, their nightgowns were folded neatly on their dresser, and their day clothes were gone from the wardrobe. The bedroom door remained locked from the outside, exactly as Joseph had secured it the night before. The windows were latched from the inside with no signs of forced entry or departure. Margaret and Catherine Broussard had simply vanished from a room that had no possible exit, leaving behind only the faint scent of bayou water and 2 identical notes written in handwriting that matched perfectly, despite the fact that the twins had never learned to write. The notes, preserved in the Iberia Parish Sheriff's Department files, contained a single sentence repeated in both girls' distinctive print: "We have gone to learn what the water remembers." The community of New Iberia in 1923 existed as a delicate tapestry woven from French Acadian traditions, Spanish colonial influences, and the complex social hierarchies that governed Louisiana's sugar plantation economy. Nestled along the winding curves of Bayou Teche, The town served as both a commercial hub for the surrounding cane fields and a cultural crossroads where ancient Cajun folklore mingled uneasily with modern American sensibilities brought by the railroad and telegraph lines that now connected this isolated region to the broader world. Main Street stretched for 6 blocks between the imposing brick facade of the First National Bank and the weathered cypress planks of Boudreaux's General Store, where residents gathered each morning to discuss weather patterns, sugar prices, and the endless stream of gossip that flowed through small communities, like water through the intricate network of channels that drained the surrounding marshlands. The commercial district reflected the town's modest prosperity, with several law offices, a hotel that catered to traveling salesmen and government officials, and 3 competing mercantile establishments that imported goods from New Orleans and shipped local products to markets throughout the South. Beyond the commercial center, residential neighborhoods spread outward in carefully maintained social stratifications that everyone understood, but no one openly discussed. The grand homes along Weeks Island Road housed the plantation owners and successful merchants whose families had accumulated wealth through generations of sugar cultivation and strategic political connections. These imposing structures, built in the Greek Revival style with wide galleries and towering columns, stood surrounded by carefully manicured gardens where magnolia trees and crepe myrtles created natural barriers between the affluent and their less fortunate neighbors. The middle-class residential areas where the Broussard family lived consisted of modest cottages and larger farmhouses occupied by independent farmers, skilled tradesmen, and professional families who had achieved comfortable lives through hard work and careful management of their resources. These homes, typically raised on brick piers to protect against seasonal flooding, featured wide porches where families gathered in the evenings to escape the oppressive heat and humidity that characterized Louisiana's climate for much of the year. Further from the town center, along the network of dirt roads that connected New Iberia to the surrounding plantations and farming communities, lived the Cajun families whose ancestors had arrived in Louisiana after their expulsion from Acadia in the 18th century. These families maintained cultural traditions and spoke French dialects that distinguished them from both the English-speaking Protestant majority and the more affluent French Creole families who claimed Spanish and French colonial ancestry. Many of these Cajun families survived through subsistence farming, fishing, and trapping in the vast wetlands that stretched toward the Gulf of Mexico. Joseph Broussard belonged to this hard-working middle class of independent farmers who had gradually accumulated enough land and resources to achieve modest prosperity while maintaining their cultural identity and traditional ways of life. His family had farmed the same section of rich alluvial soil for 5 generations, building their success through careful crop rotation, strategic land purchases during economic downturns, and the kind of patient persistence that characterized successful farmers throughout the region. The Broussard farm encompassed 120 acres of prime agricultural land, plus an additional 40 acres of cypress swamp that provided timber, hunting opportunities, and access to the Bayou transportation system that connected their property to markets in New Iberia and beyond. Evangeline Broussard had grown up as Evangeline Hebert, daughter of a prosperous merchant family whose dry goods store served customers throughout Iberia Parish. Her marriage to Joseph represented a strategic alliance between commercial and agricultural interests that benefited both families while maintaining appropriate social boundaries. Evangeline brought to the marriage not only her family's business connections, but also her education at Sacred Heart Academy in New Orleans, making her one of the few women in the community who could read Latin and speak fluent English in addition to the French dialect that dominated daily conversation throughout the region. The couple's social position allowed them access to New Iberia's educated professional class while maintaining their connections to the broader Cajun community through extended family relationships and shared cultural traditions. Joseph served as a deacon at St. Peter's Catholic Church and held membership in the Farmers Cooperative Association, positions that provided him with influence in community decision-making processes. Evangeline participated in the Ladies' Auxiliary and the Parish Library Committee, activities that kept her informed about social developments and educational opportunities throughout the region. Dr. James Thibodaux represented the small but influential group of professionals who provided essential services to the new Iberia community while maintaining connections to the broader medical and scientific communities through their education at universities in New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and occasionally in northern cities like Baltimore or Philadelphia. The son of a successful rice plantation owner, Thibodaux had studied medicine at Tulane University before completing additional training in pediatrics at Charity Hospital in New Orleans. His decision to return to New Iberia rather than establish a practice in a larger city reflected both his sense of obligation to his home community and his recognition that rural practice offered opportunities for diverse medical experience that urban specialization could not provide. Dr. Thibodaux maintained his medical office in a converted Victorian mansion on Main Street, where he treated patients ranging from plantation owners and their families to Cajun farmers and their children, as well as the African American families who worked on surrounding plantations and in the town's various commercial enterprises. His medical practice required him to travel regularly throughout Iberia Parish, often covering distances of 20 or 30 miles by horse and buggy, to reach patients in remote farming communities or along the isolated bayous where transportation remained difficult despite the region's gradual modernization. The physician's education and professional training made him uniquely qualified to recognize the medical anomalies presented by the Broussard twins, but his scientific background also made him deeply troubled by phenomena that seemed to defy rational explanation. Dr. Thibodaux maintained extensive correspondence with medical colleagues throughout Louisiana and in other southern states, regularly sharing case studies and seeking consultation on unusual conditions that he encountered. In his rural practice, the twins synchronized medical conditions and shared physiological responses represented the most challenging case of his professional career, forcing him to question fundamental assumptions about human development and individual identity that formed the foundation of his medical training. Father Antoine Malankin embodied the complex role that Catholic priests played in Cajun Louisiana, serving simultaneously as spiritual advisor, community mediator, educator, and keeper of cultural traditions that connected current residents to their Acadian ancestors and French colonial heritage. Born in Vermilion Parish to a farming family that had maintained their French language and Catholic faith through generations of political and social changes, Father Malankin had studied at the seminary in New Orleans before receiving assignment to serve the new Iberia Parish at the beginning of his pastoral career. The priest's responsibilities extended far beyond conducting religious services to encompass marriage counseling, family mediation, education of children whose families could not afford private schooling, and guidance for community members facing moral or ethical dilemmas. Father Malankin conducted masses in French for older parishioners who remained more comfortable with their ancestral language, while also offering English services for younger families and recent arrivals to the community. His theological education had prepared him to address questions of doctrine and spirituality, but the Broussard twins presented challenges that seemed to exist beyond the boundaries of conventional religious teaching. Father Malankin's observations of the twins' behavior during religious services troubled him, not only because of their apparent supernatural abilities, but also because their synchronized recitation of unfamiliar prayers and their knowledge of deceased parishioners suggested some form of communication with spiritual realms that lay outside Orthodox Catholic teaching. The priest found himself consulting theological texts and corresponding with more experienced clergy in an attempt to understand whether the twins' abilities represented divine gifts, demonic influences, or natural phenomena that required different forms of pastoral response. Marie Boudreau, the midwife who had delivered the Broussard twins, occupied a unique position within New Iberia's social structure as one of the few women whose professional skills granted her access to families across all social and economic levels of the community. Her knowledge of childbirth, herbal medicine, and traditional healing practices made her an essential figure in a region where professional medical care remained limited and expensive. Mary's grandmother had taught her the traditional knowledge that Acadian women had preserved through their forced migration and resettlement in Louisiana, including plant-based remedies, diagnostic techniques, and spiritual practices that complemented, but sometimes conflicted with modern medical approaches. The midwife's experience delivering babies throughout Iberia Parish over 4 decades had provided her with extensive knowledge of hereditary conditions, family health patterns, and the various complications that could affect pregnancy and childbirth. In a region where environmental factors like humidity, seasonal flooding, and tropical diseases created additional challenges for maternal and infant health, Marie maintained detailed records of every birth she attended, including notes about unusual circumstances, family medical histories, and environmental conditions that might influence infant development. Marie's records of the Broussard twins' birth contained observations that proved increasingly significant as the girls grew older and their unusual abilities became more pronounced. She had noted the mathematical precision of Evangeline's labor contractions, the twins' intertwined umbilical cords, their immediate visual connection, and their synchronized crying when separated. These details, which might have been dismissed as coincidental in isolation, formed a pattern that suggested the twins' supernatural connection had been present from the moment of birth. Pierre Landry, the fisherman who discovered the twins standing in Bayou Teche after their 6-day disappearance, represented the community of Cajun men who made their living from the region's abundant natural resources through fishing, trapping, hunting, and gathering activities that required intimate knowledge of the wetland environment and its seasonal cycles. Pierre's family had lived along the bayous for generations, developing skills and knowledge that allowed them to navigate the complex waterways, predict weather patterns, and locate fish and game with accuracy that seemed almost supernatural to outsiders who lacked their environmental expertise. Pierre's daily routine involved checking fishing lines and crab traps throughout an extensive territory along Bayou Teche and its tributary channels, work that required him to travel by pirogue through waterways that remained largely unchanged since the arrival of the first Acadian settlers. His knowledge of bayou conditions, wildlife behavior, and seasonal patterns made him exceptionally qualified to recognize unusual circumstances, which was why his discovery of the twins standing dry in the middle of the bayou struck him as so profoundly unnatural. The fisherman's account of finding Margaret and Catherine would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the investigation that followed their disappearance. But Pierre's limited education and his tendency to express himself in French rather than English created communication challenges that complicated efforts to document his observations accurately. Sheriff Robert Tran, who conducted the initial investigation, relied on Father Melanchon to serve as translator during interviews with Pierre and other Cajun witnesses whose testimony proved crucial to understanding the circumstances surrounding the twins' mysterious reappearance. Sheriff Tran himself embodied the complex political and social dynamics that governed law enforcement in rural Louisiana during the 1920s, the son of Vietnamese immigrants who had arrived in Louisiana during the late 19th century and established a successful restaurant business in New Iberia. Tran had achieved his elected position through careful coalition building that included support from both the established American families and the various immigrant communities that comprised the region's diverse population. His law enforcement experience had involved primarily property disputes, occasional violence related to alcohol consumption, and the complex challenges of maintaining order in a community where different cultural groups maintained their own informal justice systems alongside the official legal structure. Sheriff Tran's investigation of the Broussard twins' disappearance represented the most challenging case of his career, requiring him to navigate supernatural claims that lay outside normal police procedures while maintaining credibility with community members who expected rational explanations for unusual events. The sheriff's methodical approach to gathering evidence and interviewing witnesses reflected his recognition that the case's unusual circumstances demanded careful documentation that could withstand scrutiny from state authorities who might become involved if local investigation proved insufficient. The broader community of New Iberia residents who observed the twins' unusual behavior over the months leading up to their disappearance included teachers, merchants, neighbors, and other families who interacted with the Broussards through church activities, business relationships, and social connections. These witnesses provided crucial testimony about the twins' synchronized behavior, their apparent knowledge of historical events and deceased community members, and their increasingly frequent visits to the bayou during the weeks before they vanished. Emily Tran, Sheriff Tran's wife and the mother who had sat behind the twins during the disturbing church service where they recited names and death dates, maintained detailed diary entries that documented her growing concern about Margaret and Catherine's supernatural abilities. Emily's background as a schoolteacher made her particularly observant about child development and behavior patterns that deviated from normal ranges, while her position as the sheriff's wife gave her access to community information that helped her recognize the significance of the twins' unusual knowledge and abilities. The interconnected relationships among New Iberia's residents created a communication network that ensured information about the twins' behavior spread quickly throughout the community, generating discussions and debates that reflected the tension between traditional folk beliefs and modern scientific skepticism that characterized rural Southern society during the 1920s. Older residents, particularly those who maintained strong connections to Cajun folklore and Catholic mysticism, proved more willing to accept supernatural explanations for the twins' abilities, while younger, more educated community members sought rational explanations based on modern psychological and medical theories. This complex social environment, with its blend of cultural traditions, economic relationships, and educational backgrounds, provided the context within which the mystery of Margaret and Catherine Broussard unfolded, creating conditions where supernatural phenomena could be both documented and debated by witnesses whose diverse perspectives would prove crucial to understanding the full scope of events that transformed two ordinary children into subjects of investigation that would continue for decades after their initial disappearance. Sheriff Robert Tran arrived at the Broussard farmhouse on Weeks Island Road at dawn on November 16, 1923, less than 12 hours after Joseph had discovered his daughters missing from their locked bedroom. The morning mist still clung to the cypress trees that lined the property boundaries, creating an ethereal atmosphere that seemed to amplify the supernatural circumstances surrounding the twins' disappearance. Tran had served as sheriff for 6 years, handling cases that ranged from cattle theft to domestic disputes, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for an investigation where 2 children had vanished from a room with no possible means of exit. Joseph Broussard met the sheriff at the front gate, his face haggard from a sleepless night spent searching the property and questioning neighbors about any unusual sounds or sightings during the previous evening. The farmer's hands trembled as he recounted the events of the previous day, explaining how he had secured the twins' bedroom door with a padlock after dinner, following the same routine he had established weeks earlier when Margaret and Catherine began their mysterious evening walks to the bayou. The bedroom windows remained latched from the inside, their brass fittings showing no signs of tampering or forced entry. Evangeline Broussard appeared even more distraught than her husband, clutching the twins' identical handwritten notes while tears streamed down her face. She repeatedly told Sheriff Tran that her daughters had never learned to write beyond basic letter recognition, making their farewell messages impossible to explain through conventional means. The notes themselves presented another puzzle, as both were written in identical script that showed remarkable penmanship skills for children who had never received formal writing instruction. Dr. Thibodaux arrived at the Broussard home shortly after Sheriff Tran began his preliminary investigation, carrying his medical bag and a leather portfolio containing his detailed records of the twins' medical history and behavioral observations. The physician's presence provided scientific credibility to the investigation, while also introducing questions that law enforcement procedures were not equipped to address. Dr. Thibodaux's documentation of the twins' synchronized vital signs, shared physical symptoms, and unusual blood chemistry created a foundation of medical evidence that suggested their disappearance might be connected to physiological conditions that transcended normal human biology. The initial search of the Broussard property revealed several disturbing anomalies that complicated Sheriff Tran's investigation. The twins' bedroom showed no signs of struggle or hasty departure, with their belongings arranged neatly and their beds properly made despite the early morning hour when their absence was discovered. More puzzling was the discovery of wet footprints leading from their bedroom door to the back entrance of the house, prints that appeared to have been made by bare feet walking through water despite the absence of any water source inside the building. Outside the house, the investigation team found a trail of similar wet footprints leading from the back porch through the family garden toward the bayou, but the prints disappeared abruptly at the water's edge without any indication of where the girls might have entered the water or in which direction they might have traveled. The footprints appeared fresh, as though they had been made within hours of their discovery, but the ground around them remained completely dry despite the humid conditions that typically left morning dew on grass and vegetation throughout the region. Father Melanchthon joined the investigation at the Broussards' request, bringing with him both his pastoral authority and his growing collection of observations about the twins' supernatural abilities. The priest's presence provided comfort to the family while also introducing theological perspectives that challenged purely scientific approaches to understanding the circumstances surrounding their disappearance. Father Melanchthon shared his documentation of the twins' synchronized behavior during religious services, their knowledge of deceased parishioners, and their apparent ability to communicate with spiritual entities that remained invisible to other observers. Marie Boudreau arrived at the farmhouse before noon, carrying her leather midwifery bag and the detailed records she had maintained since delivering the twins 18 months earlier. The midwife's observations of the unusual circumstances surrounding Margaret and Catherine's birth provided historical context that helped investigators understand them supernatural elements of their disappearance as part of a continuing pattern rather than an isolated incident. Marie's knowledge of traditional Cajun folklore and healing practices also introduced cultural perspectives that suggested possible explanations rooted in beliefs that predated modern scientific understanding. The search party organized by Sheriff Tran included 12 volunteers from the new Iberia community, representing a cross-section of local residents whose diverse skills and knowledge could contribute to locating the missing twins. Pierre Landry volunteered his services as a guide through the bayou waterways, using his intimate knowledge of current patterns, seasonal water levels, and wildlife behavior to identify areas where 2 young children might survive or seek shelter. Auguste Hebert, Evangeline's brother and a successful merchant, provided financial resources and organizational skills that helped coordinate the search effort across multiple days and extensive geographic territory. The search began along Bayou Teche, following the waterway in both directions from the Broussard property, while teams of volunteers explored the network of smaller channels and marshy areas that extended into the surrounding countryside. The November weather remained unseasonably warm, with temperatures reaching the mid-70s during daylight hours, creating conditions that would have been survivable for children who possessed adequate shelter and access to fresh water. However, the region's network of swamps and wetlands also contained numerous hazards, from alligators and poisonous snakes to quicksand-like areas of soft mud that could trap unwary travelers. By the end of the first day, the search party had covered nearly 20 miles of waterways and explored dozens of small islands and elevated areas where the twins might have found refuge. The volunteers discovered no trace of Margaret and Catherine, but they did find several disturbing anomalies that suggested supernatural forces might be influencing their investigation. Multiple search team members reported hearing children's voices singing or calling for help, but the sounds seemed to move through the swamp in ways that defied attempts to pinpoint their location or follow them to their source. Thomas Guidry, a trapper whose family had worked the bayou country for 3 generations, reported encountering areas of unnaturally cold water, where the temperature dropped significantly below the surrounding environment without any apparent natural cause. These cold zones appeared to move through the waterways, creating pockets of frigid conditions that made Guidry's teeth chatter despite the warm autumn weather. When he attempted to investigate these temperature anomalies more closely, the cold areas seemed to retreat deeper into the swamp, always remaining just beyond his ability to examine them thoroughly. Emily Tran documented the search progress in her daily diary, recording not only the practical aspects of the investigation, but also the emotional and psychological impact that the twins' disappearance was having on the entire New Iberia community. Her entries revealed growing concerns about supernatural influences that seemed to be affecting multiple residents, from the search volunteers who reported hearing phantom voices to the townspeople who experienced disturbing dreams and unexplained sensations of being watched or followed during their daily activities. Dr. Thibodaux established a temporary medical station at the Broussard farmhouse, providing treatment for search volunteers who suffered minor injuries or exhaustion while also maintaining detailed records of any unusual symptoms or experiences reported during the investigation. Several volunteers sought medical attention for conditions that seemed related to their exposure to the supernatural phenomena associated with the twins' disappearance. These symptoms included temporary hearing loss, disorientation, and episodes of shared memories that volunteers claimed belonged to the missing children rather than their own personal experiences. The physician's medical records documented cases where search volunteers reported vivid flashbacks to events they had never witnessed, including detailed memories of the twins' evening walks to the bayou and their synchronized conversations with invisible presences in the water. These shared memories appeared most frequently among volunteers who had spent extended periods searching in areas where the twins had been seen during the weeks preceding their disappearance, suggesting that some form of psychic residue remained in locations where Margaret and Catherine had conducted their mysterious activities. Sheriff Tran expanded his investigation beyond the immediate search for the missing children to include interviews with community members who had observed the twins' unusual behavior during the months leading up to their disappearance. These interviews revealed a pattern of supernatural activities that had been increasing in frequency and intensity, creating a timeline that suggested the twins' vanishing was the culmination of a gradual process rather than a sudden isolated event. Multiple witnesses reported seeing Margaret and Catherine in locations where they should not have been able to travel, often appearing simultaneously in different parts of town while maintaining their characteristic synchronized behavior. Augustine Boudreau, the elderly parishioner who had recognized the historical names recited by the twins during church services, provided Sheriff Tran with access to parish records that contained death certificates and burial information for the individuals whose names the children had spoken. The accuracy of the twins' knowledge proved disturbing, as they had provided exact dates and circumstances of death for people who had died decades before their birth, information that would have been impossible for them to access through any conventional means. The investigation expanded to include examination of the twins' personal belongings, searching for any items or documents that might explain their supernatural knowledge or provide clues about their destination after leaving the farmhouse. Their bedroom contained only typical children's possessions, including dolls, simple games, and religious items appropriate for young Catholic girls. However, hidden beneath their mattress, investigators discovered a collection of drawings that depicted scenes from New Iberia's history, including detailed illustrations of buildings, people, and events from decades earlier. These drawings showed artistic skill that far exceeded normal expectations for children of their age, but more disturbing was their historical accuracy. The twins had drawn the original St. Peter's Church before its renovation in 1905, the old courthouse that had burned down in 1898, and portraits of deceased community members that matched photographs in the parish historical archives. The drawings included dates written in the same handwriting as their farewell notes, creating a timeline that suggested Margaret and Catherine had been receiving visions or communications about New Iberia's past for months before their disappearance. Father Melanchon's theological investigation focused on determining whether the twins' abilities represented divine gifts, demonic influences, or some other form of supernatural phenomenon that required specific religious responses. The priest consulted theological texts and corresponded with the diocesan office in Lafayette, seeking guidance from church authorities who possessed greater experience with unexplained spiritual phenomena. His inquiries revealed that similar cases had been documented throughout Louisiana's history, often involving children who displayed supernatural knowledge or abilities that seemed connected to the region's complex spiritual landscape. The priests' research uncovered historical accounts dating back to the early Acadian settlements that described children who served as intermediaries between the living and the dead, individuals who possessed natural abilities to communicate with spirits and access memories from previous generations. These historical precedents suggested that Margaret and Catherine's supernatural abilities might be expressions of inherited spiritual gifts that had manifested throughout Cajun history, though rarely with the intensity and precision displayed by the Broussard twins. As the search entered its fourth day, volunteers began reporting increasingly frequent encounters with supernatural phenomena that seemed designed to obstruct their investigation rather than assist in locating the missing children. Search teams described being led astray by phantom sounds that lured them away from productive search areas into remote sections of swampland, where they became disoriented and had difficulty finding their way back to familiar landmarks. These misdirection incidents appeared to follow patterns that suggested intelligent planning rather than random occurrence. Marie Boudreau consulted traditional Cajun remedies and protective rituals that her grandmother had taught her for dealing with spiritual disturbances, creating blessed amulets and herbal preparations that she distributed to search volunteers who reported experiencing supernatural harassment during their efforts to locate the twins. These traditional protections appeared to provide some relief from the disorienting effects that were hampering the search, allowing volunteers to maintain their focus and navigate more effectively through areas where supernatural influences had previously caused confusion and misdirection. The investigation's complexity increased when Sheriff Tran received reports from residents throughout Iberia Parish who claimed to have seen the missing twins in locations that were geographically impossible given the timeline of their disappearance. Multiple witnesses reported encounters with Margaret and Catherine in different towns and communities along the Bayou system, often describing interactions that occurred simultaneously despite being separated by distances that would have required hours of travel time. These sightings created an investigative puzzle that challenged conventional understanding of physical reality and human capability. By the sixth day of the investigation, Sheriff Tran had documented over 30 reported sightings of the twins. throughout a geographic area that extended more than 50 miles from their home, creating a pattern that suggested either multiple witnesses were experiencing shared hallucinations or Margaret and Catherine possessed abilities that transcended normal physical limitations. The sheriff's methodical documentation of these reports revealed consistencies in witness descriptions that made mass hallucination unlikely, while the geographic distribution of sightings suggested some form of supernatural transportation or manifestation that lay outside normal investigative procedures. The investigation reached its climax when Pierre Landry discovered the twins standing in Bayou Teche, 30 miles from their home, apparently unharmed despite 6 days of exposure to the wilderness environment. Their discovery raised more questions than it answered, as both girls appeared clean, well-fed, and physically healthy despite having no apparent access to food, shelter, or fresh water during their disappearance. Most puzzling was their location. In the middle of the bayou, standing in water that should have been over their heads while remaining completely dry above their waists. The breakthrough in understanding the Broussard twins' supernatural abilities came from an unexpected source. 27 years after their mysterious reappearance in Bayou Teche, in the spring of 1950, renovation work at the old Hebert plantation house on Grand Isle uncovered a hidden compartment behind a false wall in what had served as the estate's library. The compartment contained a collection of documents that had been sealed away for nearly a century, preserved by the dry conditions within the secret space, and protected by multiple layers of oiled canvas that had prevented moisture damage despite Louisiana's humid climate. Dr. Margaret Thibodaux, the daughter of the physician who had treated the twins during their childhood, discovered these documents while overseeing the historical restoration of the plantation house that had been donated to the Kiko, Louisiana Historical Society. Dr. Thibodaux had followed her father's career path, studying medicine at Tulane University, before specializing in psychiatric research that focused on unusual psychological phenomena and hereditary mental conditions. Her personal interest in the Broussard case stemmed from years of listening to her father discuss the medical impossibilities he had documented while treating Margaret and Catherine during their childhood. The hidden documents revealed that the twins' supernatural abilities were not isolated phenomena, but part of a pattern that had been occurring in Louisiana for over 2 centuries. The papers included detailed records maintained by successive generations of the Hebert family, who had served as unofficial chroniclers of supernatural events throughout the region since their arrival from France in the mid-18th century. These records documented dozens of cases involving children who displayed abilities similar to those exhibited by the Broussard twins, creating a historical timeline that suggested some form of recurring spiritual manifestation that affected specific families and bloodlines across multiple generations. The most significant document in the collection was a leather-bound journal written by Celeste Hebert, a plantation owner's daughter, who had lived during the early 19th century and who possessed abilities that precisely matched those later displayed by Margaret and Catherine. Celeste's journal, written in French and spanning the years from 1834 to 1847, described her gradual discovery of supernatural gifts that began with shared dreams involving her deceased relatives and evolved into the ability to communicate directly with spirits who retained memories of historical events throughout Louisiana's colonial and territorial periods. Celeste Hebert's accounts revealed that her abilities had manifested following a near-drowning experience in Bayou Teche when she was 11 years old. According to her journal entries, she had fallen from a pirogue during a family fishing trip and remained underwater for nearly 10 minutes before being rescued by her brothers, who found her unconscious but somehow still breathing despite her prolonged submersion. After her recovery, Celeste began experiencing visions of Louisiana's past and developed the ability to communicate with spirits who had died in the bayou waters over previous centuries. The journal described how Celeste's supernatural encounters increased in frequency and intensity as she approached adolescence, eventually allowing her to serve as a medium through whom deceased individuals could share information about historical events, hidden treasures, and unresolved conflicts that continued to influence the living. Her abilities attracted attention from throughout the region, with families traveling considerable distances to consult with her about missing relatives, disputed property boundaries, and other matters where communication with the deceased might provide valuable information or emotional resolution. Most importantly, Celeste's journal contained detailed descriptions of the physical and psychological symptoms that accompanied her supernatural abilities, creating a medical profile that matched exactly the conditions Dr. James Thibodaux had documented in his treatment of the Broussard twins. These symptoms included synchronized vital signs when in the presence of other spiritually gifted individuals, below normal body temperature, heightened sensitivity to electromagnetic phenomena, and the ability to access memories and knowledge that belonged to deceased persons rather than her own personal experience. The journal also revealed that Celeste's abilities had been inherited from her grandmother, Marie Claire Hebert, who had possessed similar gifts during the French colonial period and who had served as an unofficial spiritual advisor to the early Acadian settlements along Bayou Teche. This hereditary pattern suggested that supernatural abilities had been passed down through specific family lines for generations, manifesting most strongly in children who experienced traumatic encounters with bayou waters during their developmental years. Dr. Margaret Thibodaux's analysis of the Hebert documents led her to investigate genealogical connections between families who had produced spiritually gifted children over the past 2 centuries. Her research revealed that the Broussard twins were descended through their mother's line from the same French colonial families that had produced Celeste Hebert and other documented cases of supernatural abilities. These bloodline connections suggested that Margaret and Catherine's gifts were expressions of inherited genetic or spiritual traits that had been dormant for several generations before manifesting with unusual intensity in the twins. The genealogical research also uncovered evidence that the traumatic water experiences that typically preceded the manifestation of supernatural abilities were not accidental drownings but deliberate initiations conducted by older family members who possessed knowledge of the spiritual traditions that governed these inherited gifts. Celeste Hebert's journal included references to ritual submersion ceremonies that were designed to activate latent spiritual abilities in children who showed signs of possessing the necessary hereditary traits. Father Antoine Melanchon, now elderly, but still serving the new Iberia parish, provided crucial assistance to Dr. Thibodaux's investigation by granting access to church records that documented baptisms, deaths, and other sacramental activities throughout the region's history. These ecclesiastical records revealed patterns of unusual deaths and mysterious disappearances that correlated with the manifestation of supernatural abilities in specific family lines, suggesting that the Catholic Church had been aware of these phenomena for generations, but had chosen to maintain secrecy rather than acknowledge publicly the existence of spiritual gifts that challenged orthodox theological doctrine. The church records included confidential reports written by previous parish priests who had encountered spiritually gifted individuals and who had struggled to reconcile their theological training with empirical evidence of supernatural abilities that seemed to operate outside the framework of conventional Catholic mysticism. These reports described children who could communicate with deceased parishioners, predict future events with remarkable accuracy, and demonstrate knowledge of historical events that had occurred before their births. Most disturbing among the church documents were reports of exorcism attempts that had been conducted on children who displayed supernatural abilities similar to those of the Broussard twins. These exorcisms had universally failed to eliminate the children's gifts, instead often resulting in the deaths of the young subjects or their complete disappearance from the community. The ecclesiastical records suggested that church authorities had gradually learned to distinguish between demonic possession and inherited spiritual gifts, developing protocols for managing spiritually gifted individuals that emphasized secrecy and containment rather than elimination or public acknowledgement. Dr. Thibodaux' medical research expanded to include interviews with elderly residents throughout Iberia parish who possessed personal memories of the Broussard twins and other individuals who had displayed similar supernatural abilities. These oral history interviews revealed that Margaret and Catherine's reappearance in Bayou Teche had been followed by a period of enhanced spiritual activity throughout the region, with multiple families reporting increased incidents of ghostly manifestations, prophetic dreams, and communications with deceased relatives. Marie Boudreau, now in her 70s but still mentally sharp, provided detailed accounts of her observations during the twins' childhood and the supernatural phenomena that had accompanied their disappearance and return. The elderly midwife revealed that she had maintained secret records of all the births she had attended, noting unusual circumstances that might indicate the presence of inherited spiritual gifts in newborn children. Her records documented patterns of prenatal development, birth complications, and early childhood behaviors that seemed to predict which children would eventually manifest supernatural abilities. The midwife's records also revealed that she had been providing guidance to families who produced spiritually gifted children, using traditional knowledge passed down through generations of Cajun healers and midwives to help parents understand and manage their children's unusual abilities. This informal support network had operated in secrecy for generations, protecting spiritually gifted individuals from persecution while preserving the cultural knowledge necessary to guide their development and integration into the broader community. Pierre Landry, the fisherman who had discovered the twins in Bayou Teche, provided additional testimony that shed light on the supernatural phenomena associated with their disappearance and return. Now approaching 60 and still working the Bayou waterways, Pierre revealed that his discovery of Margaret and Catherine had been preceded by several days of unusual spiritual activity throughout the region's waterways. He described encountering areas of luminescent water that glowed with soft blue light during nighttime fishing trips, phenomena that local folklore associated with the presence of powerful spirits or the manifestation of supernatural events. Pierre's testimony also revealed that the twins' apparent ability to stand dry in the middle of the bayou was not unique but represented a spiritual gift that had been documented throughout Cajun history among individuals who possess strong connections to water spirits. According to traditional beliefs, these individuals could walk on water surfaces, remain dry while submerged, and travel vast distances through bayou systems by supernatural means that transcended normal physical limitations. The fishermen's accounts were corroborated by other elderly residents who remembered similar supernatural events from their youth, creating a body of oral tradition that supported the documentary evidence discovered in the Hebert archives. These testimonies revealed that spiritually gifted individuals had periodically appeared throughout Louisiana's history, often during periods of social upheaval or environmental crisis, when their abilities were needed to provide guidance or protection to their communities. Sheriff Robert Tran's original investigation files, preserved in the Iberia parish records, contained additional evidence that supported the supernatural explanations that were emerging from Dr. Thibodaux' research. The sheriff had documented numerous witness statements that described impossible events, but his official reports had emphasized rational explanations and avoided references to supernatural phenomena that might have damaged his professional credibility or created public panic about spiritual activities beyond normal law enforcement capabilities. The sheriff's private notes, discovered among his personal papers after his death in 1948, revealed that he had been convinced of the supernatural nature of the twins' abilities, but had chosen to maintain public skepticism while secretly investigating the historical and cultural factors that might explain their gifts. His unofficial research had led him to conclusions similar to those reached by Dr. Thibodaux, recognizing that Margaret and Catherine represented the latest manifestation of spiritual traditions that had been active in Louisiana for centuries. Emily Tran's extensive diary entries, spanning the period from the twins' disappearance through their eventual departure from New Iberia as young adults, provided detailed documentation of their continued supernatural activities and their gradual integration into roles as informal spiritual advisors within the Cajun community. Her records revealed that both twins had continued to demonstrate enhanced abilities throughout their adolescence and early adulthood, serving as intermediaries between the living and the dead while maintaining carefully constructed facades of normalcy that allowed them to function within conventional society. The diary entries also documented the twins' eventual decision to leave New Iberia permanently, traveling to remote areas of Louisiana where their abilities would be less likely to attract unwanted attention from authorities or researchers who might seek to exploit their gifts for commercial or scientific purposes. Emily Tran's final entries about the twins described their departure as a necessary protection of spiritual traditions that required secrecy and isolation to survive in a modern world increasingly skeptical of supernatural phenomena. Dr. Thibodaux's comprehensive analysis of all available evidence led to her publication in 1952 of a groundbreaking research paper that documented the existence of inherited spiritual abilities within Louisiana's Cajun population. Her work, published in the Journal of Psychiatric Research under the title Hereditary Mediumship Among Franco-Louisiana Populations, presented scientific evidence for supernatural phenomena while maintaining academic credibility through careful documentation and statistical analysis of genealogical patterns. The research paper attracted attention from universities throughout the United States and Europe, establishing Dr. Thibodaux as a leading authority on inherited psychic abilities and their relationship to cultural traditions and genetic factors. Her work provided a scientific framework for understanding phenomena that had previously been dismissed as folklore or superstition, creating opportunities for legitimate academic research into supernatural abilities that had been active throughout human history but rarely subjected to rigorous scientific investigation. However, the publication of Dr. Thibodaux's research also attracted unwanted attention from government agencies and private organizations that sought to identify and potentially exploit individuals who possessed supernatural abilities for intelligence gathering, military applications, or commercial purposes. This external interest created new dangers for spiritually gifted individuals and their families, forcing many to adopt even greater secrecy and protective measures to avoid becoming subjects of unwanted experimentation or coercion. The revelation of the historical patterns surrounding the Broussard twins and similar cases throughout Louisiana's history provided answers to many questions about their supernatural abilities while also raising new concerns about the protection and preservation of spiritual traditions that had survived for centuries through careful secrecy and cultural isolation. The evidence suggested that Margaret and Catherine had been the latest in a long line of spiritually gifted individuals whose abilities served important functions within their communities, but who required protection from a modern world that might seek to exploit or destroy what it could not understand or control. The modern consequences of the Broussard twins' supernatural manifestation continue to ripple through Louisiana communities even today, creating an invisible network of families who carry the burden of inherited spiritual gifts while navigating a world that remains largely ignorant of their existence. In the decades following Dr. Margaret Thibodaux's groundbreaking research, government interest in psychic phenomena intensified dramatically, forcing spiritually gifted families throughout the region to adopt increasingly sophisticated methods of concealment and protection. The establishment of secret government programs designed to identify and recruit individuals with supernatural abilities created a climate of fear that persists among Louisiana's Cajun communities. Families who had previously maintained informal support networks for managing spiritually gifted children were forced to operate with extreme caution, using coded language and elaborate security measures to protect their most vulnerable members from potential exploitation or forced participation in classified research programs. Margaret and Catherine Broussard themselves vanished completely from public records after 1955, when both women were in their early 30s and had established lives in remote areas of southwestern Louisiana. Their disappearance from documentation appears to have been carefully orchestrated, involving the systematic elimination of their names from official records and the creation of false identities that allowed them to continue their spiritual work, while avoiding detection by government agencies or academic researchers seeking to study their abilities. Local folklore suggests that the twins continued to serve as spiritual mediators for isolated Cajun communities throughout the 1960s and 1970s, helping families communicate with deceased relatives and providing guidance during times of crisis or uncertainty. However, their activities became increasingly secretive as external pressures mounted, forcing them to limit their interactions to trusted individuals who could guarantee absolute discretion about their supernatural gifts. The genetic research initiated by Dr. Thibodaux's work eventually identified specific bloodlines that carried elevated probabilities for manifesting psychic abilities, creating detailed family trees that traced hereditary patterns across multiple generations. This genealogical mapping provided valuable scientific data, but also created dangerous vulnerabilities for families whose names appeared in research databases, making them potential targets for government surveillance or coercive recruitment efforts. Contemporary reports from throughout Louisiana describe ongoing supernatural phenomena that appear connected to the spiritual traditions documented in the Broussard case. Residents of Bayou communities continue to report encounters with children who display unusual abilities, including the capacity to communicate with deceased individuals, predict future events with remarkable accuracy, and demonstrate knowledge of historical events that occurred long before their births. These modern manifestations follow patterns identical to those established by Margaret and Catherine, suggesting that the spiritual forces responsible for their gifts remain active throughout the region. However, families who produce spiritually gifted children now face challenges that previous generations never encountered, including the need to protect their children from sophisticated surveillance technologies and aggressive recruitment efforts by organizations that seek to exploit supernatural abilities for commercial or military purposes. The technological age has created new complications for managing inherited psychic gifts, as digital communication systems and electronic monitoring devices can detect and record supernatural activities that would have remained private in earlier eras. Families with spiritually gifted children must now navigate complex security concerns while preserving cultural traditions that require direct personal contact and intimate community relationships to function effectively. Recent developments in neuroscience and genetics have provided partial explanations for some aspects of inherited psychic abilities, identifying brain structures and genetic markers that correlate with enhanced sensitivity to Tukiyuko, electromagnetic fields, and quantum mechanical phenomena. However, these scientific advances have also intensified interest from research institutions and government agencies that view spiritually gifted individuals as valuable resources for advancing understanding of human consciousness and developing new technologies for information gathering and communication. The legacy of the Broussard twins extends beyond their immediate community to influence broader discussions about the relationship between science and spirituality in modern American society. Their case demonstrated that supernatural phenomena could be documented and studied using rigorous scientific methods while maintaining respect for cultural traditions and individual privacy rights. However, it also revealed the dangers that spiritually gifted individuals face when their abilities become known to organizations that prioritize exploitation over protection. Educational institutions throughout Louisiana now maintain informal networks that help identify and support children who display supernatural abilities, providing guidance to families while maintaining strict confidentiality about the nature of their services. These support systems operate through connections between teachers, counselors, and healthcare providers who understand the unique challenges faced by spiritually gifted children and their families. The preservation of Cajun spiritual traditions requires ongoing vigilance and adaptation to changing social conditions that threaten the secrecy and isolation necessary for their survival. Modern communication technologies have made it more difficult to maintain the cultural isolation that previously protected spiritually gifted individuals, while increasing population density and urbanization have reduced the availability of remote areas where supernatural abilities can be practiced without attracting unwanted attention. Climate change and environmental degradation pose additional threats to the bayou ecosystems that have traditionally provided spiritual connections for Louisiana's psychically gifted population. As water levels change and natural habitats are destroyed, the spiritual forces that have maintained these supernatural traditions for centuries may be weakened or eliminated entirely, potentially ending genetic lines that have preserved these abilities for generations. The ultimate significance of the Broussard twins lies not in the mystery of their supernatural abilities, but in their demonstration that human consciousness possesses capacities that transcend current scientific understanding. Their story reveals the existence of inherited spiritual gifts that have operated throughout human history, providing services and insights that benefit entire communities while requiring protection and secrecy to survive in societies that fear or seek to exploit what they cannot comprehend. Today, visitors to the Louisiana Bayou country occasionally report encounters with mysterious children who display abilities reminiscent of Margaret and Catherine Broussard. These sightings occur most frequently in remote areas where traditional Cajun culture remains strong, and where families continue to maintain the spiritual practices that have preserved psychic abilities across multiple generations. While these reports cannot be verified through conventional investigation methods, they suggest that the supernatural forces responsible for the twins' gifts continue to manifest among Louisiana's spiritually gifted population. The mystery of Margaret and Catherine ultimately asks us to consider whether scientific understanding and spiritual wisdom can coexist in a world that increasingly demands rational explanations for phenomena that may transcend human comprehension. Their story demonstrates that some aspects of human experience cannot be fully understood through conventional analysis, requiring instead the preservation of cultural traditions and spiritual practices that honor the complexity of consciousness, and the possibility that reality encompasses dimensions beyond those accessible to ordinary perception. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.